Mage 40K, Episode 4, Let My People Go. Once more our merry band of misfit madcap mages moved on from a successful mission in our ongoing quest to fix the 40K universe, per the Emperor's command. We had convinced a sizable Orc to, if not exactly ally with the Imperium, at least agree to a policy of non-aggression until we killed everything else. Then the Orcs and the Humies could face each other for a proper, all-out war. This counted as success in our book, as we probably wouldn't be around to deal with the consequences, and so we eagerly awaited our next set of orders. We received them at the edge of the Orc system. As we neared the Geller Point, the minstrel Space Marines left us. They had been mostly professional, but there had been some grousing about coming all this way only to stand around on a ship and not kill Orcs. The phrase, "shut up and soldier, soldier," didn't actually appear in that conversation, but it was heavily implied. We did accuse them of whining about murder blue balls, but they took that in stride. Still, they departed, and our party relocated to the bridge to see what horrors would come next. Once there, Sarge helpfully informed us that yet another group of Marines, this one far smaller in number, would be joining us with fresh directives. We asked where they were, and a deep voice from behind us said, "Right here." It may have been a little unseemly for inquisitorial agents to jump half out of their skin, but considering Sarge did it too, and was facing the direction the Marine appeared from, we felt a little better. Especially when he identified himself as Brother Sergeant Caw of the Raven Guard. Our lore-knowledgeable members informed everyone else about their legendary stealth abilities, and we felt a little better that even our magical senses had been deceived. Also, Weeb started fanboying out over the armor and the stealth and the claws and everything, and just kind of collapsed into a squeeing pile. The Marines and other inquisitorial agents were good enough not to mention that, as we tried to maintain some semblance of dignity. Brother Caw and his squad, it soon turned out, had been selected for just that reason. You see, this next mission involved taking steps to deal with the Eldar issue, and would require at least some ability in stealth. We were headed to a recently, as in only the last 1,000 years or so, colonized world of the Adeptus Mechanicus, which was in the process of being harvested for resources and converted to a forge world. There was only one moderately sized hive on the planet so far, and the rest was a fairly pleasant temperate forest world. That wouldn't last for long, of course, and the Cogboys were busily strip mining and clear-cutting the verdant sphere. And apparently some Eldar had taken exception to that, as there was a knife-eared army in the act of invading the place. They had space assets, but not enough to supply the forces that were engaging the hive. The Admech had called for help, and one Lord General Inquisitor Rupert and his personal retinue/army had soon arrived to stem the Eldar advance. They were currently holding the city, although it was a difficult task and reinforcements were desperately needed. While the Administratum ground into motion, we were to A. act as a stopgap to preserve the Imperial presence, and B. find some way to acquire an Eldar Farseer. Well, technically, according to the hand-scrawled note, we were to save the stupid Cogboys or maybe just blow everything up like you always do. I don't really care. Just get me one of the pretentious knife-eared Farseer douchebags. E. Ridiculous as that order was, at least it meant that we probably weren't dealing with the murder pervert Drukhari. Most of us took it in stride, but Weeb spent a good 10 minutes ranting about how we were all going to get turned inside out by a time-mastering space elves who'd been doing magic for literal millennia. We said he was overreacting and gave him a dose of Twitch's tranquilizers, which helped. Most of our travel time was spent learning stealth skills from the Space Marines, both physical and mystical. Not that they knew magic, but their talent at disappearing was definitely supernatural, and once we flashed our Emperor-given license, they were happy to show us a few tricks. Very friendly fellows, if in desperate need of a joint and a hug. But we basically spent weeks playing magical hide-and-seek, and it was a great time. We also palled around with the guards and the rest of the crew, and improved our overall relations with everyone. Everyone but Twitch, that is, who was very pleased to be leaving the Orc system, even if it was to deal with the Eldar. He was less pleased, however, at the presence of our new crew member/pet, Whiny the Gretchen. We had mystically neutered him so that he wouldn't produce any orcoid spores, and brought him aboard to join our xenotechy coven. I mean, the little git had crafted a perfect sphere in a few minutes. Out of scrap. Who knew what he could do with some actual tools, material, and our mystic mojo? There were some complaints, of course, especially about his status as mech-grot, until we held up the sphere, shrunk back down after its use as a giant basketball, for the cogboy contingent to see. Their complaints abruptly stopped, and their eyes popped out of their skulls. Literally, in some cases, on little metal stalks. Then Jim snatched the sphere from our hands and said, This is very interesting. This is needful of further study. This is ours now." Then the techies grabbed Whiny by the wrist and dragged him off to a new life as a xeno-engineer. Before they made it out the door, Mills held up the perfect tube and hollered, "He made this too." One of the engine seers scuttled over, snatched it, muttered a curt, "Thanks," and scooted back to the group. We considered it a small price to pay for harmony and the occasional bullshit device. We figured keeping Whiny confined to the tech decks would help pacify Twitch, and any other crew. And it mostly did, but the orc-hating paranoiac still had an issue with us. We tried to ask him about it, but even when cornered, all he could really say was that we felt kinda green. This was a bit disturbing, and we did some deep, introspective reflection. By which I mean we scanned one another with all of our magical senses and artifacts to see what nonsense was going on now. And, as it turned out, our prime sight showed that we all had big green thumbprints on our forehead. The favor of Gork and Mork, apparently. Some experimentation far away from everyone else showed that when we did things in an orky manner, i.e. shouting and shooting in all directions and screaming wah at the top of our lungs, it seemed to work better than mere physics would allow. Neat, and certainly not something that would come back to bite us. Anyway, between our stealth training and social interactions, the trip to the Cogboy planet passed fairly quickly. Soon enough, we were on a shuttle headed down to the Hive City's most elite spire. We were told it was so swanky the food even had flavor. Freaking Cogboys. Of course, we should have trusted in the Rupert, because the headquarters we were escorted to was in the midst of a luxurious hotel, with some of the finest food and alcohol we had sampled in this universe. Also, for some reason, the entire guards party and most of the upper echelons of the command had found one excuse or another to accompany us as far as the Rupert's dining room. Those who hadn't had sent along doggy bags and space Tupperware with their names labeled, and a list of dire threats about what would happen if they didn't get their share. By the second course, we could understand their position. The dinner was excellent, and the Rupert was wonderfully friendly, even to a bunch of lunatic, warp-blasted blighters like us. He also spoke at length about our current mission and the status of the planet, but between his aristocratic patois and the good booze, we didn't get one word in 10. Fortunately, his personal Batman, Alfred, knew about this sort of thing, and took us aside as everyone moved to the lounge for cigars and coffee to actually explain things. It seemed that the bigwig cogboys had meant their call for aid to reach a nearby AdMech system and not be intercepted by a passing Inquisitor, and were a little salty about our collective presence on the planet. The Eldar army outside the Hive walls was preventing them from being too unhelpful or outright hostile, but only barely. It was like there was something the Mechanicus was trying to hide here. But given that even the mighty on switch was considered a sacred mystery for the cogboys, that might just be business as usual. Regardless, we should probably stay out of sight around any Skitarii or mech forces as much as possible. Friendly fire accidents happened all the time, after all, and it didn't pay to take undue chances. Alfred then showed us a map of the Hive, the plane it sat on, and the nearby forest, and pointed out who owned what. Behind the Hive was the main body of Mechanicus forces, protecting us from flanking attacks and waiting to reinforce the inquisitorial troops when it came time for a push. The front of the Hive was being defended by a trench line manned by the Rupert's army, a short distance from which was the Eldar front lines and its static emplacements. Well, static in the sense that they didn't appear and disappear at random intervals and in random places, as much of the Eldar army did. Alfred said we didn't know exactly what the Eldar had in their army, or where it was placed, but the large forested area south of their front was marked Eldar territory. Everything in between and on the plain to the east and west of the hive was considered contested territory, and we were informed that we were liable to meet both Eldar and Admech patrols in these areas. The best he could tell us was that they figured the reinforcements were coming from one of those webway gates that the Eldar were supposed to use. Based on some tactical mathematics and advanced guesswork, Alfred said there were probably 1 or 2 larger primary gates and 3 or 4 smaller ones, all branching off from the terminal or whatever it was that connected the whole planet to the Infernal Network. We could shut them down individually or find some way to cut them off at the root, but it would be greatly appreciated if we could deal with them in some fashion. We thanked Alfred for the information and asked him to guide us to a quartermaster so we could concoct our cunning plan, which was basically to throw some low-level grunt uniforms on so that we didn't look like a bunch of Inquisition agents. Just a bunch of random guards. On a cogboy planet. With no PDF or guard regiments in the system that weren't assigned to the local Inquisitor. Still, we chose low-level disguises, so if anyone spoke to us, they would assume we didn't know anything interesting or have the ability to report to anyone that mattered. At least, that was the plan. Plus, it allowed us an excuse to wear our new necrodermis-infused flak armor. All except for Bard, that guy, and Mills, who decided that, while the armor was useful, being seen as guards wasn't so much, especially since they weren't particularly stealthy, even with all the training. So, at Bard's suggestion, they stenciled the word journalist on their armor and ran around with recorders, asking every guard, Skitarii, cogboy, or Eldar they saw what they thought of the war and their opinion on immigration. It didn't so much keep people from seeing them as disinclined people from being seen by them, which more or less accomplished the same thing. Also, that guy insisted he was from the Daily Wa and only drew crude pictograms. Everyone tried to ignore him. So equipped, we set out into no man's land to make our way to Eldar territory. There was a river on the far east of the plain, and the map didn't have any markings for that area. Alfred said that it had occasional patrols from both sides, but less than the plains. So we moved along the edge of the Skitarii encampment, keeping out of sight as much as possible, and toward the woods on the other side of the river. Things were going well, and spirits were high, until we got to the edge of the water and began looking for a means to cross. This was when a pair of Eldar chose to attack from nowhere. Literally, they popped into existence from somewhere and opened fire on us without so much as a hello. It was only by chance that Mills managed to dodge most of the cloud of glittering, cotton candy-like stuff that blasted out at her. It didn't seem that dangerous, until it absolutely shredded a chunk of her necrodermis armor and some of her favorite bits of flesh. Green-blooded, knife-eared sons of bitches and their effete weaponry, trying to fool us. We weren't having any of it, and the fight was on. Competence started the combat with her usual bullshit, leveling her ray gun and transforming the oxygen around one of what Bard identified as warp spiders into titanium. It wasn't a lot of metal, but it also merged with the outer layer of the guy's armor, solidifying his joints and trapping his body in a stiff, thin sheath. He couldn't teleport away, because he would just take the metal casing with him, so he tried to break out by main force. But every time he started straining and grunting behind his helmet, Competence repeated the process and added another layer. This kept the pair of them entertained for the moment, and the rest of us closed on the remaining Eldar. Well, most of us. Weeb helped to heal Mills from the lacerating damage. Her armor healed itself handily enough. As Competence kept the one knife ear engaged, the rest of us traded fire and dodging with the other one for a bit. While this was going on, Critical noticed that he had not been spotted by any of the Xenos attackers. Arcane cloaking was a form of mystic invisibility, and he had practiced it a lot. So, chuckling to himself, he moved surreptitiously around to the rear of the warp spider as it huddled behind a tree searching for a target, readied his power fist, and attacked. He didn't hit it in the head. He didn't punch through its spine. He didn't break any bones. No, the idiot punched the ancient, dignified Eldar warrior straight in the ass. Critical later claimed that he was trying to cripple it, but we heard the giggling. The Eldar didn't collapse or die or anything, but it did jump into the air with a shriek of light pain and heavy outrage. Then, grasping its left butt cheek, It whirled around, definitely noticing Critical now. "What the hell is your problem?" it shrieked. "Who does that? Who sneak attacks someone in the ass? No, don't answer that. I can see the joke on your primitive monk-eye face. Gods, what is wrong with your species? This is totally unprofessional. I am done. Who is your commanding officer? I'm going to file a complaint. We may be enemies and you may be xenocidal savages, but even you have standards." This haranguing went on for some time, as most of us just stood there and tried our best not to laugh. We did level our various guns while the Eldar wasn't looking, just so it wouldn't try anything with the gun again, but the fight seemed to be well and truly out of this one. Back in the more serious section of the battle, not actually serious, mind you, but at least more so than the 1,000 Years of Death attempt, Welshie moved to help Competence settle her back and forth with the trapped Eldar. It kept almost busting out, and Competence kept reinforcing the shell, but sooner or later one of them was going to tire. So Handy decided on a non-violent solution, which was a first for us. He summoned his elvish construct, crafted from the mannequin-esque unpopulated universe of an RPG that he had written some years before, and with her and Competence, opened a portal to said universe, which basically served as his personal pocket dimension. Then the elf grabbed a hand dolly, set the captive Eldar on it, and wheeled him over like Hannibal Lecter. As the warp spider saw himself being moved toward a rift in reality, he started screaming and writhing, claiming our primitive minds couldn't possibly shield such a tunnel, and we were going to get him eaten by she who thirsts. His partner heard the screams, and the name, and turned to assist, but was stopped short by the threat of our guns and another ass-punching, and a barrage of random, pointless questions about favorite sports teams from the press corps. The first spider's pleas reached a high crescendo as he got closer to the glowing portal, until they stopped with an abrupt, "Huh?" as he reached the other side. The elf maiden wheeled him up a grassy hill to a small pavilion, where she served light refreshments. The Eldar was still stuck, so she held the cup up for him to slurp from, after removing his helmet, of course, and then popped a cucumber sandwich into his mouth. Well, she was a horrible Anglophile. Anyway, after a few minutes of calm snacking, the elf grabbed the dolly and started to wheel the man back out. The screaming started up again, but this time it was less about the dangers of the journey and more about, "Don't make me go back!" This devolved into a brief bout of sobbing once he crossed over. By this time, his companion had been convinced that we weren't actually hostile, because we worked for the Inquisition and were investigating the Mechanicus forces. We were certain the Eldar knew the Inquisition was on planet, even if only the Rupert's people, but they didn't have to know why, and they would be more willing to work with conniving bastards than indoctrinated grunts. Regardless, we allowed him to check on his companion, who, once the magical metal shell was removed, slumped to his knees and cried, "It was so beautiful. Everything was green and fresh, and I couldn't feel her at all. She wasn't gnawing at my soul. I want to go back. Please." The second Eldar was clearly shaken by this announcement, but also clearly intrigued. Finally, we let him step through the portal, just to confirm, but had a rope around his waist and yanked him back before he could get more than 3 steps into his bid for freedom. It was still Welshie's universe, and he didn't want strangers running around in it and touching his things. Once everyone had finished weeping and reciting nostalgic poetry about better days, which took about half an hour, we asked if the warp spiders knew about the multiverse. This was greeted with stunned silence, and after some explanation, aided by a magically produced whiteboard, we got them to understand that we had a whole, fresh universe. One of its worlds was populated by Welshie's constructs, which might evolve eventually, but there was a literal everything else that had no owners and definitely no demons. And we were willing to share for the right price. Of course, we knew these two couldn't make any decisions, but maybe they could relay information to someone who could. Or just kick the idea around, see who in their armies was interested. You know, just a casual chat. Whatevs. Certainly not an attempt to subordinate enemy forces, not at all. The dazed warp spiders agreed that, yes, someone should definitely know about this, and could they maybe go back to base to report? We said sure, and to just ask for interrogator competence if they wanted to talk again. Or have some more tea. They poured it away somewhere, and we crossed the river line to continue on our search. Once we were on the other side of the river, we tried to be stealthy just in case we ran into random patrols. Well, some of us tried. Welshie, riding high on the success of his scheme, started singing the Tom Bombadil song. When that guy and Bard objected, loudly enough to be heard over the caterwauling, Welshie insisted it was an advertisement for the Tolkien verse, and that it was all part of his, quote, cunning plan. Several of the saner party members wondered that we didn't draw any hostile attention as we tromped through the forest, half of our party arguing and singing at full nerd volume. But sometimes you just get lucky. Regardless, following the river down to near the Eldar territory, we retreated a bit to a small clearing out of sight, and set up a scrying spell. We took our time, and everyone contributed their abilities. It must have looked very silly from outside as we variously danced, meditated, did martial arts, self-flagellated, played with phones, prayed for help finding "the sneaky gits," and so on. But, however stupid it may have seemed, it worked, and we were able to pinpoint the 6 gate locations scattered around the map. We had no idea which ones were big and which ones were small, but we did have an idea of where they were. Concerningly, a couple were up at the very northern edge of the map, flanking the unsuspecting Skitarii forces. We figured that one of those would probably be worth investigating, not only to help our allies, but hopefully to strike at a smaller gate first so it would be less guarded, and therefore easier to poke around with so we could learn about the tech. Also, the other nearby one was in the middle of Eldar territory, not far from their frontline forces, and we thought that sounded like an if-we-have-to type mission. So we once more set off, back the way we had come, keeping to the far side of the river from the Xenos-held territory. And once more there was song. This time, Welshie launched into Bilbo Baggins, and those of us helping him hold the idiot ball joined in. Spend too much time in a starship, and fresh air does something to you, I guess. This time, Competence and Critical, our sanest members, again, not sane, just sane-est, were sure that they spotted a few Eldari watchers, but we were never attacked. They supposed it was like making a lot of noise on a hike to scare away any nearby wild animals, except that we were broadcasting stupidity loudly enough to befuddle any watchers and convince them that there was no conceivable way we were a threat. Beware the power of obfuscating stupidity. So it was that we were in high spirits as we approached the gate location, and had enough sense to stop singing before we got within earshot. We crept around to a nearby hill overlooking the target area, moved to the crest, and peeked over. At first, we couldn't see anything, but then everybody remembered the magic, and our various extra-normal senses were employed. Sure enough, there was a smallish warp gate, big enough to let through a tall humanoid with a big hat, or maybe a skinny dreadnought, but not any major vehicles or walkers, although Weeb later informed us that it didn't actually work like that, and size didn't actually matter. And once our eyes stopped watering and we could spot them clearly, there were 2 of the warp spiders, maybe or maybe not our new converts, along with about 10 women in white armor and helmets with manes of bright red hair. Several of us had played enough Dawn of War to recognize banshees. Great. While a few of us had studied martial arts, and some could even magically power up their combat abilities, we weren't trained melee combatants the way these warrior women were. And, being Eldar, they probably had some way or another of dealing with our magic bullshit. This was not going to be an easy fight. But then, we thought, did it have to be a fight? Despite being human and working for the Inquisition, we weren't actually Imperials. We thought bigotry and xenophobia were bad, and valued sapient life. At least a little bit. Also, these weren't Dark Eldar. These guys weren't evil, per se, just huge dicks. Deserving of a swift kick to the genitals and all the low-level grief we could give them, sure, but not death. At least, not until they forced our hand. So maybe we could settle this peacefully. We decided to take the direct approach, and Welshie summoned a white flag on a stick. We ditched our guard and journalist disguises for the inquisitorial uniforms we had brought along just in case, and got ready to commit diplomacy. Of course, we weren't stupid, so Critical and Mills grabbed the special explosive and homing turtle shells that we had made for our orcish death race. The Trojan Squig was still undergoing repairs back on the ship. unslung a launcher that we had brought along, and scurried up a nearby tree to take overwatch. The rest of us set off brazenly down the hill, flanked by two of Welshie's elvish constructs, and singing about the bravest little hobbit of them all, and the promise of a better world. Or maybe just being weird. Same difference, really. The Eldar were shocked to see us marching openly towards their picket line. In part, no doubt, because they were supposed to be invisible, but we could clearly see them. This, and the general cheeriness of our party, allowed us to approach to a diplomatic distance, i.e., close enough to shout, but too far to easily stab, without drawing any fire. "Hello! We come in peace!" Apparently, this was not what they had expected, because there was some confused muttering before one of their number tentatively shouted, "Liar!" "Well, we're lazy cowards, and we come to bargain because it's easier and safer than fighting. How's that?" "Slightly more believable, but we still don't trust you." We took this as a positive sign. Then, because lube is for sissies, we went straight to our trump card. "There are multiple universes with different versions of reality. How would you like to go to a private universe without Slaanesh?" You could have heard a pin drop on the grass in the ensuing silence. Or, to be more literal, 3 swords and a pistol thumped soddenly to the ground. Then, one we took to be the leader, based on the ornateness of the armor and the hair, pressed to the front of the crowd and hissed, "I'm sorry, I must have had some crazy in my ear. The fuck?" "Yeah, and we can prove it, too." With that, Welshie was trotted out to do his little trick again, and he soon had a portal open to his pocket dimension. It wasn't easy to pierce the bonds of reality and cross the multiverse, especially when you were doing it by bending space-time through correspondence magic, which the more abstract spirit and mind mages considered the long way. So this time the portal only appeared as a hole a few feet across, floating at about head height. Several of the Eldar shuffled around to get a better look through, but none were willing to put their head through what looked for all the galaxy like a magical noose/guillotine. This issue was discussed, and a bit more magical assistance was fed into the spell by the rest of the group. The Banshees watched warily as we did our spells, weapons at the ready, and seemed almost disappointed when our strange brand of magic didn't result in demons devouring our souls. But we enlarged the hole to easily fit a humanoid, even one with enormous headgear. After that, it was all down to picking someone to go through. Bard jumped back and forth a few times to show that there were no demons, but none of the Eldar was keen to trust what they were sure was some form of unprotected warp travel. So a discussion was had amongst their number, which ended with one of them talking animatedly with their leader before the latter issued some Eldari bark which we couldn't understand, but which clearly translated as, "And that's an order," because the hapless Banshee slunk towards the portal, grumbling all the while. Finally, after a lingering pause in front of the aperture and another shouted command, she threw herself across the barrier, landing on the grass in the alternate universe. The Banshee did the usual checking that all her appendages were there. We were informed later that, from her perspective, she noticed that she had not been torn apart by demons. Then she paused for a moment, and noticed that there were no demons in this universe, including no giant demoness of pleasure nibbling at her very soul. Then, with a cry of, "Free!" the Eldar warrior was away and off over the hills. By the time she came back into view atop the next rise, she had doffed her armor and was clad only in a body glove. We all stood and watched her go, and as the Banshee leader started to curse, Welshie told her not to worry, and that he could reach any point in his universe at will to retrieve her. We eventually found the wayward Eldar frolicking in a field of wildflowers, and when she was unceremoniously yanked back to the 40K universe, there was a lot of screaming and crying before she collapsed into a ball and refused to speak to anyone. By and large, this was seen as confirmation of our story, but the Banshee leader was a military sort and needed an actual after-action report. So another Banshee was selected, this time with a bit less grumbling, and was sent through the portal. But they were only allowed to go a few feet, and the rope was employed again to make sure. When this one tried to have it away on their heels, we gave a mighty yank and got them back into our universe. After the tears were dried, this Eldar confirmed that, yes, indeed, it was a very pleasant universe, entirely devoid of Slaanesh, and could she go back, please, right now, please? The leader said no, and then ordered us to stay where we were while she got someone with a lot more rank to deal with this. The order was polite, though, since we had just offered the literal answer to all of their prayers. In fact, we were told that we weren't actually prisoners, and were free to go, so long as we didn't actually try to leave or anything until the boss had spoken to us. So we got comfortable and settled down to wait. The Eldar Guard did their best to remain professional, but it was very hard when you had a lot of chatty, casual humans milling about with nothing better to do. Finally, a bunch of Elton John-looking mothers stepped out of the webway gate, marched their fabulous selves over to our group, and demanded that Bard show them the other universe. Bard pointed out that it was both Welshie's spell and his universe, and were they some sort of racist who thought all humans looked alike. They said yes, this was in fact the case, and then stepped smartly in front of Welshie and reissued the demand. Our correspondence mage was pretty worn out from the repeated casting of a very potent spell, and it took a few tries and some assistance from the rest of the party, but we got it done. The Farseer leading their group began to step through, but we insisted on the rope. They said it was undignified, but we pointed out that weeping in the fetal position was even less dignified, and had the still traumatized Banshee as proof, and the point was conceded. The Farseer didn't actually need it, but it was a close thing. She stood for a few minutes, basking in the purity and lack of demonic hellscapes, then, as we called politely, gave a sigh that contained millennia of weariness, and, shoulders visibly slumped, stepped back into the Mechanicus planet. We respected that. Apparently, Eldar leaders were leaders for a reason. Or at least had a lot of willpower and self-control, which was still impressive. And after that, the Farseer took a moment to collect herself, then came back to us. "Very well, humans. What terrible price do you want in exchange for this irreplaceable jewel? I would threaten you, but I don't want to risk destroying the access point." She didn't say, "At least until we know how to do it ourselves," but we all heard it. Help us defeat Chaos and the Tyranids?" And we explained about the multiverse and the incursion into our home universe. This also involved an argument that we could be trusted not to give in to our innate bigotry and try to kill the Eldari just because, as we came from a universe where bigotry was considered bad. At least to most people. And after you help us take out the big threats, the Emperor wants you to leave this universe to the humans. Also, try not to murder-fuck another pain goddess into being. Also, no Dark Eldar allowed. Those guys are creepy and gross and we don't want them touching our stuff. They acknowledged the creepiness of the Drukhari, and asked if that was all. When they got a cheery, "Yep," the Farseer went into vapor lock for a few minutes. Then she started pacing back and forth, arguing with herself about our trustworthiness, the overall sanity of the situation, and how we might be lying, then refuting all her own arguments one by one. She even started ticking things off on her fingers. Honestly, we probably would have had a very hard time with this, except that we had shown her actual, factual, undeniable proof, and could do it again at any time. Well, maybe after a nap and a Gatorade, but basically any time. Also, the idea that if we were lying, we would have come up with a less ludicrous lie seemed to feature a lot in the ponderings. Finally, she turned her gaze back to us and said simply, "Everything in me says this is a trap, and it's too good to be true. But I can't find any reason not to agree to this plan. Even if it is a trap, you're offering us literally everything we've ever wanted. The Eldar as a race can't afford not to try." And so victory was achieved, and Welshie became Eldar Moses, leading the people to the Promised Land, no heaps of Eldari dead required. And if his pocket universe happened to have a few one-way holes where beneficent Tolkien elves / Vanyar could influence things, the Eldar didn't need to know about that. We informed the Farseer that the Emperor had requested her presence to hammer out some details, especially after we informed Big E of Plan Multiverse, and she agreed, finding it a fairly small price to pay for the deal. As an aside, the Emperor wasn't too thrilled about the plan, and started throwing a tantrum about getting his own universe with, quote, blackjack and hookers. We told him in no uncertain terms that he couldn't have an Edenic paradise until he finished his dystopia. The Farseer did say that she would inform the other craft worlds, and have them spread the word around to the remaining Eldar and Exodites. Also, she would be taking a guard to meet with the Emperor. We said, of course. Then she informed us that Welshi could consider himself permanently under Eldari guard, at least until there was more than one person who could gift them a virgin universe. And we said this made sense too, so long as they respected his me time. We asked if they would be pulling their army out now, since this was clearly a maiden world that they were planning to occupy and that the Cog Boys had stolen. But now they didn't need any maiden worlds, since they had a maiden verse. They agreed, but said that, for our sakes, they couldn't actually do that. You see, the Cog Boys, in stealing this planet and setting up a forge hive on it, had stumbled onto some Eldari webway tech, and they were busily screwing around with it while hiding it from the rest of the Imperium. This had been the reason for the Eldar invasion in the first place, because, apparently, the webway was just chock full of demons. Something about Magnus being a big baby and wrecking everything. So fucking around with the webway without any knowledge of what parts were safe and what weren't was a sure recipe for a new Eye of Terror. We thought about this, then asked if they would be willing to cease firing and allow some of us humans to try and beat the stupid out of the others. The Farseer reluctantly agreed, presumably on the principle of, "Oh, what's one more dent in the universe if you're planning to leave soon anyway?" They would remain to make sure we didn't screw it up, but they would allow us to deal with it in our own lunatic fashion. So we called the Rupert on the secure Vox, informed him of the change of status with the Eldar, and the Cog Boy's stupidity. There was a jolly cry of, "Ha! Knew the mechanical blighters couldn't be trusted! Alfred, issue Order 77 to the men and let's go rust bucket hunting! Tally-ho!" We called him back to prevent any actual shooting before we could do some sneaky stuff, but he seemed on board anyway. And with no more ceremony than that, the Inquisitorial army began to turn, or at least get ready to turn, on the untrustworthy Cog Boys. Still, having come to terms with the Farseer, we gave our contact information and the Emperor's Vox number, and they left to start telling the rest of the knife-ears the good news. For our part, we hurried back to the hive to support the Rupert in his attempt to stop the Mechanicus' suicidal stupidity. We took the direct route through No Man's Land, figuring that the Eldar didn't want us dead, and the Cog Boys should be otherwise occupied. We didn't draw any fire, but only a little way across the bombed-out wasteland, another group of Eldar popped out of a crater. They were clearly being polite about it, because they didn't just jump out right next to us, but actually let us see them as they approached. Their weapons, which weren't aimed at us but weren't not aimed at us either, helped convince us to stop and chat. Also, the fact that everyone was wearing riotous colors and motley. We knew a troop of harlequins when one danced out at us. They politely but firmly asked us to accompany them to speak to someone who was very interested in our little project. Preferring to keep all of our appendages where they were, we promptly agreed, and were led back to the webway gate we had just left, into the portal, and through a long, twisting series of misty tunnels. Finally, we turned a corner into a door. Opening the door, we found ourselves on a stage in front of an empty auditorium. We stopped short and looked around for our guides, but they had disappeared. Then came the eerie strains of strangled calliope music, followed by the biggest freaking clown you've ever seen. Chegarak, the Eldar laughing god. We were generally acting in a pro-Eldari fashion, so we should probably be okay. But you never know with gods, especially tricksters. We didn't need to worry, as it turned out. You see, we had our own experience with tricksters, especially Coyote, who liked to run around in the form of a cartoon rabbit when we talked to him. In fact, Bard had sworn himself to the trickster and had formed a totemic bond. So when Chegarak started to loom over us, he simply said, "Don't worry, y'all, I got this," and stepped forward. "Greetings, Lord Trickster, and good day to you," said as a form of greeting and not a comment on the actual date, time, or quality thereof. "Ah, little wizards, I do hope you are well," said as a form of pleasantry and not any commitment to anyone's health or well-being. They went on like this, and after about half an hour had managed to say hello and ask about the weather. Turns out, legalese was invented so tricksters could talk to one another. Anyway, as associates of Coyote, to a greater or lesser degree, We were to be considered guests of Chegarak and his Harlequins. Not that this meant we were safe, mind you, but it was some reassurance that the god wasn't actively seeking our demise. Probably. Unless it was a good joke or some sort of lesson. Regardless, the Laughing God had called us there because he had heard about our little multiverse-based scheme. Rather unbelievably quick to our way of thinking, but that's God's for you. And it interfered with his big joke on Slaanesh. You see, if you remove all the Eldar, then I will have nothing to use for my plan to destroy the Prince of Excess. I can't say what exactly it entails, because that would spoil the joke. But it involves all the Eldari dying, then Slaanesh eating them, then their souls turning into the god of death in her stomach. Or something like that. I'm still workshopping it. So your plan is interfering with mine. But, all things considered, it is a pretty good plan you have, so maybe we can work something out. Wait, chimed that guy. Your plan involves killing all your own people? Yes, basically. Okay, I'm terrified of you now, so I'm just going to sit here quietly. And so it was that we started our divine brainstorming session. Tea and cozy chairs were summoned, meditation was engaged in, and a few of our less savory party members started a small circle some ways away, passing around something illicit to, quote, get the creative juices flowing. Chegarak immediately joined in, and a few puffs later, groggily declared us pretty cool for a bunch of nerds. Eventually, by fair means and foul, we came up with a new plot. We would have the craft world, and Exodite, Eldar start setting up colonies and landing areas in the new universe, while the bulk of their forces helped us deal with the Nids and demons. In the meantime, we would go to Kamara and use the Dark Eldar to destroy She Who Thirsts, because they wouldn't be missed. We would poison the lot of them, spiritually, and then use our spirit magic to rip open a massive hole to the warp in the middle of the Hell City, and just let nature take its course. Slaanesh would devour the lot of them, ingest the poison, and be destroyed. Or at least substantially altered. Because, you see, the only thing we could think of that would poison the Dark Eldar, and from thence a Dark God, was something truly vicious. Right before we killed them all, we were going to drop a conscience bomb in the middle of Kamara. Imagine spontaneously developing empathy with an Eldar's brain capacity to extend it to its fullest reach, after thousands of years of the darkest sadistic cruelty. Then, just as the existential horror starts to hit, boom, straight to Slaanesh's gut, so she gets all of the 1,000 years of regret and self-loathing horror multiplied by millions, all at once. It might not kill her outright, but it was sure going to ruin her day. Weaponized morality. But hey, we were Americans. We could weaponize anything. This was the best, only, idea we could come up with. We thought Chegarak might object, since he worked with the Drukhari, but his exact words were, "Hey, sometimes you can't make an omelette without murdering millions of perverts. They're gross and creepy. You do what you gotta do." He even offered us resources to help in our mission, both for him and for the Emperor. Well, actually, what he offered was a library card, but Weeb helpfully explained that the Black Library contained all Eldar knowledge for most of the galaxy's history, and this was a huge friggin' deal. We were instructed to return to one of the webways after dealing with our mad mechs, where some Harlequins would be waiting to take us to the library's door. We were sure it wouldn't be that easy, because, trickster, but we resolved to deal with that later. Upon our return to the planet, we once more set out for the hive, and this time arrived unimpeded. While the Rupert may have been a ridiculous parody of an aristocrat, he was actually very good at this whole war thing, and had secured the routes between his troops and his office long before we asked him to stop shooting elves and start shooting cogboys. On the plus side, we were only dealing with a small forge, and it mostly produced a series of screws, so it wasn't like we were trying to tussle with a war-focused planet. But there were still plenty of Skitarii and Mechanicus forces to handle. I mean, think of how many screws the Imperium uses in a day. Not everyone got assigned to the sexy Manufactura, but they took their job seriously regardless. So, rather than face them head on, we needed to be cunning. Good thing we were practiced at that. After a few minutes of rejecting a number of ideas as, quote, too war-crimey, we settled on breaking into the noosphere and committing a mass rickrolling. On loop. Or forcing everyone to listen to Nyan Cat for 10 hours. We didn't have the technological know-how to break into their system and start hurting massive groups, but we could definitely force a distraction through magical bullshit. From there, we just had to go to the lowest level of the hive, where the Eldar tech no doubt was left where it had been found, and apply high explosives until the problem was resolved. Simple, right? Right. Or at least that was the initial plan, and we were studiously poring over maps of the hive, its walkways and thoroughfares, and Mechanicus held routes to the depths where the webway gate was located, and also asking the Rupert how many levels of the city really needed to stay intact, when Weeb had a bright idea. Looking askance at Bard, who tended to do this sort of thing in all our games, usually on accident, Weeb tentatively suggested making a cult. You see, the Mechanicus liked shiny, fancy metal things. We had one of those that was, in fact, currently the object of obsession for all the cogboys on our ship. We could retrieve that, and use it as a holy object to convince the AdMech of our authority. Through magic. This sounded like a more reasonable and humane plan than summoning several miniature black holes, which was the next suggestion on the list. We took a shuttle back to the O Imperator Quare, leaving the Rupert and the cogboys very carefully not shooting at one another, yet, and staged a raid on our techies. There was a lot of shouting and threats of dark vengeance, until we told them that they could keep Whiny, and with enough bullying and magical bullshit he could easily make another. The little grot gulped when we added, or else. This and the threat of throwing psych stuff at everyone won the day, and we were soon back planetside with the sphere, which Competence, at Weeb's urging, magically transformed from regular steel to auramite, the golden version of ceramite that the Custodes used. Competence had helpfully spent her years in the palace magically scanning the composition of various sci-fi materials to bring back to Earth and capitalize on, so it wasn't too hard to do. Then came the piece de resistance. You see, we were direct agents of the throne on Terra, and had long since established a direct magical route to the Emperor, or at least the Custodians, not trusting the vagaries of astropathic communication, or the trustworthiness of astropaths themselves. So we called up Big Daddy E and asked him to imbue a small portion of his wisdom into the sphere. Specifically, the imperial spirit of common sense, making the golden orb basically a magic 8-ball, but better. He thought cursing the Mechanicum with some basic sense sounded like a good idea, although he didn't care for the whole cult thing. Until we said it was going to be a cult of rationality and progress, and promote the development of new technology. This caused much laughter, and a few spirit rituals / imperial nonsense later, the magical orb gave sound advice to any petitioner who placed their hand on it. Now to get it to the cogboys and convert them to our worldview. We figured a big procession full of pomp and ceremony would befit this holy relic, which, given its prominence and shape, we named Imperator Nux Sinestros, or the Emperor's Left Nut. Fortuitously, the Rupert had plenty of bunting, confetti, brass bands, and mounted guard on standby for the glorious victory processional that he had planned for the inevitable conclusion of the campaign against the perfidious Eldar. In fact, it was so inevitable that he had planned the victory parade before he even planned the first battle. But we weren't ones to look a gift horse in the mouth, so we took them and added an unconscionable amount of gaudy gold paint, per the Emperor's instructions. Everyone was having fun adding to the ostentation of the whole thing, until that guy suggested that maybe a coterie of space marines would help us look important. Weeb and Bard supplied that, for most of the Imperium at large, the Astartes were barely more than a myth, and no one expected to ever see them in their lifetimes. So, yeah, that would probably help. Now, how did we get them on side? Turns out, all we had to do was hold the sphere up to Brother Caw and say, "Touch it." After some goading, he reluctantly agreed, heard the celestial voice of the Emperor talking to him, and telling him to listen to us, and immediately turned and left the chamber, We were somewhat puzzled by this reaction until his second-in-command, after receiving some information on their private Vox network, helpfully informed us that the remaining Marines were acting as guards, while the brother sergeant went to make a very important call straight to the Raven Guard chapter master. Then he was going to send out a request for reinforcement from all nearby Marine chapters. Because, you see, there was going to be a new chapter formed to protect this amazing, universe-shattering relic, which was not going to be leaving Space Marine possession from now until ever, although we were nicely allowed to keep holding it until a more official guard detail could be arranged. I mean, the Emperor literally talked to them and gave them advice. That sort of thing is kind of a big deal to Astartes. So, preceded by fanfare, surrounded by inquisitorial guardsmen, and flanked by a squad of the Angels of Death, our band of mages processed through the hive, sphere held high. We made for a chapel conveniently located near the AdMech sections of the hive, drawing huge, awestruck crowds as we went. Said crowds included a lot of red-robed flunkies, who brought word of the relic to their superiors. As we went, Bard ducked out, caught one of the spies, and made sure that he noticed the perfectly spherical nature of the device, too. The spy thanked him for his helpfulness and made sure to convey that information as well. So it was little surprise when our parade was met at the steps of the chapel, not only by the highest ecclesiarch on hand, but also a small group of highly placed cogboys, their retinues waiting politely but menacingly a small ways away. Demands were made, very nicely, because there were a number of post-human giants on hand to ensure manners. Before things got too tense, we had the coggiest cogboy trundle up on his wheels and touch the sphere. We weren't fool enough to actually let him hold the damn thing, but still. A divine, machine-based voice, text-to-speech device, remember, informed him that he should shut up and get out of the way of the competent people. The tech priest let out a bleat of binaric, and all the red-robed figures dropped to their knees, or knee analogs, in reverence and allowed us to pass. After that, it was all over but the shouting, or holy chanting in this case. With the Emperor's left nut telling everyone to listen to us, we marched in full array down to the Webway Gate. This involved a trek through the Underhive, but between the Army, the Mech Boys, and the friggin' Space Marines, no one dared to attack us, although we did once more attract quite a crowd. Once there, we told the Cogboys that the Webway was, currently, full of demons, but the Emperor had a plan to fix that and open it up. It was a long-term mission, though, so they weren't allowed to fiddle with this gate, at least until the Emperor gave them the all-clear. They didn't like this, but between the sphere backing us up and the promise that they could play with their toys once they were safe, they complied. Also, I really can't emphasize enough the presence of a squad of Space Marines with very large guns that were willing to enforce our testicle-based orders. That done, we made arrangements with the Cogboys and the Raven Guard to turn this from a forge world into a chapter fortress, which did some forging on the side. The mechs weren't too thrilled, but the impending arrival of dozens of Astartes and their equipment kind of forced their hand. But, since the founding relic was a semi-mechanical one, they were allowed to maintain a presence, and the crankier Cogboys were granted a position examining/revering the orb. Also, we gave them a large chunk of necrodermis to play with, and we suddenly had some new friends. Sarge would be in charge of mediating things and generally representing the voice of reason. And, as a special treat/petty revenge, Tink, the Mechanicus-hating techie, was made the Cogboy liaison, although Sarge was allowed to forcibly retire him to prevent an actual shooting war. All of this done, we returned to the Webway, and, no other options immediately presenting themselves, Bard stuck his head through and shouted that we were ready to go. Before long, a motley-clad arm poked through and beckoned us. We entered through the gate, and then heard a loud crash as it was forcibly closed behind us by the Eldari. Then, Chegorok stepped out and welcomed us. He said that, before he could take us to the library, he had to make sure that we were who we said we were. We assured him that we were, and offered to show ID, but he stated that we might not even know who we were ourselves. This cryptic comment hanging in the air, there was a bright flash, and each of us found ourselves standing alone in a nondescript room, just like any other part of the Webway, with several entrances ranged about the space. As we watched, through the portals stepped 6 versions of each of us, all slightly different. Well, this was weird. than normal. End of chapter 4. Thank you everyone for listening. I will say this one was probably the most fun I have had with this campaign so far. And as DM, I kept coming up with, oh yeah, they're going to have to sneak through and be stealthy, and the Farseer will be porting around to these different sites, and they'll have to gamble on which one they can get and find all this tech. Nope. They just brute forced it of like, what if we offered them literally everything they've ever wanted to just fuck off? And they did. And that bit where the Farseer vapor locks, that also happened to the DM, me. As I was sitting there going like, I want to say no, but there's literally no reason why this should not work and should not be the answer to all of their problems, because you can prove it. Like, right, you have proof right there any old time. And they just did. And it totally threw me, but in a way that was so much fun. We were laughing so hard at it, had a great time. And then I said, okay, well, I'll make it so that, it turns out the AdMech was up to something the whole time, because they were. That was the reason the Eldar were there. But they, so you have to fight your way through the AdMech, and you'll stealth through them, and you'll do these fights and fight through the Underhive, and it'll be a whole thing. Nope. Again, about the time we were talking black holes and collapsing whole sections, somebody went, hey, what about that sphere? And sure enough, yeah, they just culted their way out of it, and it was hilarious, and it was totally threw me, but it was so much fun. And again, some of it was just, it made too much sense lore-wise not to work, and some of it was they also had the most bullshit rolls, which is very true of this campaign, which is, again, I like big, spectacular, rule of cool games, so we are having a lot of fun with this. This has been my favorite chapter so far, even though they've all been a lot of fun, but I hope you enjoyed it. We will see you in the next one, where we all get to fight multiverse variants of ourselves. That'll be neat. Have a good one. Take care. Bye.